In 2014, three NATO member states met the alliance's target of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. In 2025, all 32 did. That shift, from 3 to 32 in 11 years, is one of the most rapid collective military buildups in the history of democratic alliances. And it is only the beginning. In June 2025, at a summit in The Hague, those same 32 nations committed to a new target. Not 2%, 5% by 2035. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called it a transformational leap. President Trump called it a historic achievement. Both were right. Whether the pledge translates from declaration to delivered capability depends on a decade of sustained political will that NATO's history of burden-sharing disputes makes anything but guaranteed. This documentary examines what is driving this transformation, not the headlines, but the structural forces that produced it, and what it will cost. World military expenditure reached $2,887 billion in 2025, the 11th consecutive year of increases. The global military burden, defense spending as a share of global GDP, reached 2.5% in 2025. That is the highest level since 2009. Here is the number that contains the story. The main engine of growth was Europe, where military expenditure surged 14% to $864 billion in 2025. Among NATO's European members, that is the fastest annual increase since 1953. Germany, the country whose constitution famously constrained military spending for 80 years after World War II, crossed the 2% GDP threshold for the first time since 1990. Its military spending grew 24% in a single year to $114 billion, and Germany has since pledged to reach 3.5% of GDP by 2029. But this is not only a European story. Across the Anglosphere, the 5 English-speaking democracies that form the backbone of the Western intelligence and security architecture, a parallel transformation is underway. The United States approved over $1 trillion in defense spending for 2026. President Trump's budget proposal for 2027 reaches $1.5 trillion. Australia committed to its largest defense spending increase in history, planning to reach 3% of GDP by 2033 and committing between 425 and 560 billion Australian dollars to capabilities over the next decade. The United Kingdom announced a defense investment plan of £298 billion over 4 years and committed to building up to 12 new nuclear-powered attack submarines. Something has changed. This documentary asks what, and whether the democracies undertaking this historic military expansion can actually afford it. To understand the present, this documentary identifies 4 turning points, each of which produced a measurable acceleration in defense spending. The first was 2014. Russia's annexation of Crimea was the moment that ended the post-Cold War peace dividend for the governments that were paying attention. It was the moment that revealed what many defense analysts had argued for years, that the assumptions underlying the 1990s disarmament consensus were not as safe as the budget decisions of the preceding decade had implied. At the 2014 Wales Summit, NATO members agreed to stop cutting defense spending and begin moving toward the 2% of GDP target. 3 countries met the target when it was agreed. The response among most European governments was gradual at best. The second turning point was 2020. COVID-19 produced what many governments and analysts describe as a supply chain awakening. Governments discovered that decades of efficiency-driven global supply chains had created dependencies in medical equipment, in semiconductors, in industrial capacity that could not survive a major disruption. That discovery drove a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between economic efficiency and strategic resilience. And it produced the political conditions for industrial policy and defense policy to merge in ways not seen since the 1940s. The third turning point was February 24, 2022. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine shattered the remaining assumptions of the post-Cold War security order. For 3 decades, European governments had operated on the assumption that major interstate war in Europe was not a realistic planning scenario. Within days of February 24th, that assumption was gone, and with it went the political resistance to defense spending that had prevailed for 30 years. The fourth turning point is 2025. The Trump administration's national security strategy, released in December 2025, explicitly conditioned the U.S. commitment to NATO on allies assuming their fair share, and characterized decades of accumulated imbalances as a problem that Washington would no longer simply absorb. That document changed the political calculation for every NATO member that had been sheltering under American guarantees without paying the full cost of them, and it produced the Hague Summit's 5% commitment, which is both a genuine strategic decision and a political response to the pressure being applied from Washington. These four turning points, 2014, 2020, 2022, 2025, are the structural explanation for what is happening. The question this documentary now examines is whether the resources committed to this transformation can actually be translated into military capability, and whether the countries making these commitments can sustain them fiscally. Begin with Australia, because Australia's commitment is the most structurally significant of any Anglosphere country outside the United States. In April 2026, Australia released its 2026 National Defence Strategy and accompanying integrated investment program. The document states explicitly that the international system is under greater strain than at any time since the end of the Cold War. It commits Australia to between 425 and 560 billion Australian dollars in capabilities and equipment over the next decade. It plans to reach 3% of GDP in defense spending by 2033. And at the center of Australia's defense transformation is AUKUS, the trilateral security partnership with the United States and the United Kingdom, announced in 2021. AUKUS will be the costliest defense program in Australian history. The Australian government estimates total AUKUS costs at 368 billion Australian dollars over more than 30 years. Everything from submarine construction to personnel, infrastructure, and the industrial base needed to support nuclear-powered vessels. In fiscal year 2026 to 27 alone, Australia's total defense budget reached 62.6 billion Australian dollars, 45.2 billion US dollars, a 2.02% of GDP commitment that will grow to 3% by 2033. The Australian Submarine Agency, the government body overseeing AUKUS Pillar 1, saw its budget increase 33% in the latest year, with staffing growing from 833 to 1,209 personnel. Australia is also spending between 50.7 and 68.6 billion US dollars from 2026 to 2036 on the SSN-AUKUS submarines themselves and related infrastructure, and between 28 and 35 billion Australian dollars on long-range strike capabilities over the same period. This is not a marginal increase in a peacetime defense budget. It is the largest military transformation Australia has undertaken since World War II. Now here is the United Kingdom. In June 2026, the UK published its Defence Investment Plan, a £298 billion commitment across the 4 years from 2026 to 2030. The plan was not without political cost. Defense Secretary John Healey resigned over concerns about the plan in early June 2026, signaling that even those who supported increased spending had reservations about its pace and structure. The UK has committed to building up to 12 SSN-AUKUS submarines, expanding the Royal Navy's nuclear submarine fleet from 7 Astute-class boats. Construction of the new submarines is being carried out by BAE Systems at Barrow and Rolls-Royce at Derby. BAE alone will require an additional 5,500 workers over the coming decade. The UK's defence nuclear enterprise, covering both the deterrent Dreadnought program and the conventional SSN AUKUS program, will consume between 20 and 25% of the entire defence budget. But here is what makes the UK's position particularly significant. In February 2026, HMS Anson became the first Astute-class submarine to visit Australia under the AUKUS Optimal Pathway. Days later, war broke out in the Middle East. HMS Anson cut short her planned month-long visit after just 2 weeks. Reportedly the only available astute, to relocate to a conflict zone. That single episode illustrated the tension at the heart of Britain's defense commitment. The UK has committed to AUKUS. It has committed to NATO. It has committed to £298 billion of investment. And it demonstrated in real time that its existing fleet is under such operational pressure that it could not fulfill both commitments simultaneously. This is not a criticism of the UK's strategic intent. It is an honest description of the gap between political commitment and current operational capacity. Now here is the United States. U.S. military spending was $954 billion in 2025, a 7.5% decrease from 2024, primarily because no new military assistance for Ukraine was approved during the year. But Cypri was clear about what comes next. The decline is likely to be short-lived. Congress has approved over $1 trillion for 2026. President Trump's 2027 proposal reaches $1.5 trillion. The U.S. National Security Strategy of December 2025 identifies 2 priority goals: maintaining dominance in the Western Hemisphere and deterring China in the Indo-Pacific. And the U.S. is simultaneously investing in nuclear modernization, conventional capability expansion, the Golden Dome Missile Defense Initiative, and the Shipbuilding Industrial Base, with $29 billion allocated for shipbuilding and maritime infrastructure in 2026 alone. Now here is the picture for Canada and New Zealand, the 2 Anglosphere countries where the gap between political commitment and strategic delivery is most acute. Canada committed to the NATO 2% target and met it in 2025. But Canada's defense industrial base is significantly smaller than its peers. New Zealand has historically spent well below 2% of GDP on defense, and its geography, population, and strategic role have produced a distinct security calculus from its larger Anglosphere partners. Both Canada and New Zealand have sought AUKUS Pillar 2 engagement, consulting on advanced technology areas, including autonomous maritime systems and quantum technologies. Neither has the industrial depth of Australia or the UK, and both face the same fundamental question that all democratic governments face when they make commitments of this scale. Can they actually afford it? Here is the fiscal context that makes this military expansion historically unprecedented in its complexity. The current economic environment is sobering, in the words of Cypri's own commentary on NATO's 5% commitment. Debt levels among many NATO member states are relatively high, and the fiscal sustainability of several of them is questionable. The United States had its credit rating downgraded by Moody's in May 2025 over concerns about the trajectory of its debt. France's debt reached 112% of GDP in the last quarter of 2024. 2 out of 3 major ratings agencies assessed France's credit outlook as negative. The United Kingdom's debt interest bill is approximately £110 billion per year, the 4th largest item in the government's budget. And yet all of these governments, with fiscal positions that would have been considered deeply stressed in earlier historical periods, are simultaneously committing to defense spending increases measured in the hundreds of billions. The defense industrial system faces a separate structural constraint. Decades of post-Cold War defense cuts did not just reduce military budgets. They reduced the industrial capacity to produce military equipment. Shipyards were closed, production lines were mothballed, skilled workforces dispersed. The United States discovered this explicitly when it committed to AUKUS, finding that its submarine industrial base could not produce the boats needed at the pace required. The CSIS analysis of AUKUS is direct on this point. The shortfalls in U.S. submarine production did not originate with AUKUS. They are the result of decisions made decades ago to reduce the number of U.S. shipyards capable of producing and maintaining nuclear-powered submarines, and to slim down U.S. supply chains in the name of efficiency over resilience. This is precisely the problem that every Anglosphere government faces. The political decision to rearm has been made. The fiscal resources, though strained, are being committed. But the industrial capacity to translate money into capability cannot be rebuilt in years. it requires decades. Here is how four analytical traditions interpret this transformation. The government position, shared broadly across Washington, London, Canberra, Ottawa, and Wellington, is that the security environment has deteriorated to a point where the investment is necessary regardless of cost. China's military spending has grown at sustained pace for decades. Russia has demonstrated that it will use military force to revise borders in Europe. North Korea has supplied ammunition to Russia's war in Ukraine. Iran's influence networks extend across multiple theaters. The government position is that democratic alliances that do not invest in their own security are not safer. They are exposed. The free market critique, from economists and fiscal conservatives, is that defense spending at the scale now being committed represents a significant reallocation of capital from productive civilian investment. Every dollar spent on a submarine or an air defense system is a dollar not spent on infrastructure, healthcare, education, or tax relief. The opportunity cost is real and will compound over time. The anti-war and progressive critique from academics and civil society is that the rearmament narrative creates self-fulfilling conditions for conflict. The argument is that treating China as an inevitable adversary reduces the political space for diplomatic resolution and increases the risk of miscalculation. The international strategic perspective from RAND, USA, IISS, and CSIS is that the question is not whether to rearm, but whether the rearmament is being done effectively. The concern of most serious analysts is not the scale of the commitment, but the risk of spending large sums of money poorly. Cypri has already warned that NATO's new 5% target risks incentivizing creative accounting, and cited Italy's reported attempt to count the cost of building a bridge to Sicily as military-related spending as an illustration of what loose definitions produce. Before the conclusion, the skeptics challenge. What evidence would challenge the central thesis of this documentary? First, the deterrence success argument. The case for Western rearmament rests on the assumption that military investment produces deterrence, and that deterrence prevents conflict. The counter-argument is that military escalation by democratic alliances produces countervailing escalation from China and Russia, and that the security environment is worsened, not improved, by the current trajectory. The evidence that would test this. Whether Chinese and Russian military spending continues to grow in response to Western rearmament, or whether diplomatic engagement produces de-escalation that military spending did not. Second, the fiscal sustainability argument. Most of the Anglosphere governments making these commitments are doing so at debt-to-GDP ratios that historical analysis would identify as fiscally stressed. If interest rates remain elevated and debt service costs continue to crowd out productive spending, the defense commitments being made today may be revised by future governments facing harder fiscal trade-offs. Third, the capability gap argument. Spending more money on defense does not automatically translate into more military capability. Defense cost inflation means that nominal budget increases often translate into smaller real capability gains than the headline numbers suggest. The gap between political announcement and delivered operational capability is a documented feature of every major procurement program in recent history. If the AUKUS submarines arrive a decade late, if the F-35 sustainment costs continue to rise, if the shipbuilding industrial base cannot be rebuilt at the pace governments are projecting, the security case for the investment is weakened even as the fiscal cost compounds. Here is what can be stated with confidence and what cannot, what we know. World military expenditure reached $2,887 billion in 2025. CIPRI confirmed. All 32 NATO members met the 2% target in 2025, for the first time since the target was set in 2014. NATO has committed to 5% of GDP by 2035, Hague Declaration confirmed. Australia committed to $45.2 billion in defense in fiscal year 2026 to 27 and plans to reach 3% of GDP by 2033. UK committed £298 billion to defense over 4 years. U.S. Congress approved over $1 trillion for fiscal year 2026. Russia's military burden reached 7.5% of GDP in 2025, the highest ever recorded according to SIPRI. Germany crossed 2% for the first time since 1990 and has pledged 3.5% by 2029. What we do not know, whether the 5% NATO target will be met by 2035, or whether fiscal constraints will force revisions. Whether the AUKUS submarine program will deliver on its projected timeline, current assessments suggest significant execution risk. Whether U.S. defense spending at $1 trillion plus is fiscally sustainable alongside the current debt trajectory. Whether China and Russia will interpret the Western buildup as deterrence or respond with further escalation. Whether the industrial base can be rebuilt fast enough to translate political commitments into operational capability. The most defensible evidence-based interpretation of this transformation is this. The Anglosphere is engaged in the most significant collective military buildup since the early Cold War. The strategic logic is coherent. The political commitment is real. The fiscal strain is significant. The industrial gap is real. And the outcome, whether this investment produces the deterrence its proponents claim, will not be knowable for years. What is clear is that the era in which democratic governments could treat defense as a residual budget item to be funded after every other political priority had been satisfied is over. Whether it ended because the security environment demanded it, or because political leaders in Washington and London and Canberra willed it, or both, the numbers are the same. The world is rearming. The Anglosphere is leading it. And the bill is arriving at a moment when the fiscal position of most democratic governments leaves limited margin for error. I am the Anglosphere Report. The stories your local media won't connect. Tell me in the comments. Do you think the Anglosphere's military buildup is a necessary response to a genuinely more dangerous world? Or does the scale of the commitment create its own risks, fiscal, industrial, and strategic? See you next time.